Hi, I'm Em, and this is Fang Farrier. Today, we're talking sleep. So how are you sleeping? It's been a funny old time for it, and even before the pandemic hit, the World Health Organization had declared a sleeplessness epidemic throughout industrialized nations, meaning that kind of 2/3 of all adults in developed nations were failing to get their 8 hours of sleep a night. So 8 hours being World Health Organization's recommendation for daily or nightly, I guess, sleep. So why would I have it here and in our podcast? Well, I was giving a webinar recently about anxiety and how to manage anxiety. And part of that, we were talking through building a resilience toolbox, essentially kind of something that gives you the skills or the resources you need to kind of dip into for managing kind of stress when it's at any level. So be that kind of everyday life, or be it pandemic life and when things get thrown at you sideways. And it got me thinking back to my nutrition coaching and personal training kind of side of things, and the foundations for this kind of building resilience skills and coping mechanisms and managing to kind of stay on top of things and not be overwhelmed starts in the same foundations of just basic health. So it's foundation stones for health, for mental health, and for building resilience on. And those are sleep, movement, and nutrition. So I used to kind of have them round that probably movement and nutrition were the highest up there. But sleep is a major player in this, and I suppose if you look at them, they're a bit more like a Venn diagram in that they all overlap and one will influence the other. In terms of nutrition, if we're not eating well, we'll find that maybe we don't have the energy to move the way that we want to, or that and that both of those things might impact the way we sleep. Whereas on the other hand, if we're not sleeping well, then we're going to struggle to maybe make great food choices or have the motivation or energy to move the way that we would like to. So kind of starting with that kind of foundation in mind, and with a view to using this series more of a looking at those things we can do that will increase our resilience. And the toolbox idea is that rather than have a list of things you have to do, it's kind of having a list of things that are available to do or at your disposal, or quite easy to develop skills that might work for you, because not everything will work for everybody. And until you kind of try these things out and see whether they make a difference in your life, whether it's something that you want to pick up and do, you won't really kind of have an idea of what's going on. But it means if you can practice it almost in a time of peace, then when you really need it, it's more readily accessible and easier to kind of use and get your head around, and you've already filtered out the stuff that doesn't work for you. So sleep, as I say, it's not a particularly exciting topic. It's everybody knows that you need sleep. That losing sleep or kind of staying up all night is not a great idea in terms of being at your best self the following day. There's an Irish proverb that says a good laugh and a long sleep are the best cures in the doctor's book, and that's quite right, because in terms of sleep, it's when we miss out on it, our immune system's dropping, we're more prone to just being kind of run down and picking up more kind of viruses, which obviously in this day and age is a huge deal. It's disrupting your blood sugar levels, so your increased risk of diabetes and weight gain, which has a knock-on effect to increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. It's you're likely to feel hungrier because you are low you're looking for that kind of energy that you haven't regained from your sleep, or the recovery you haven't gained from your sleep. So looking for kind of sugary or high energy hits of food which don't necessarily hit the spot. So you tend to feel hungrier and less able to satiate. So in terms of, as I say, my other world is kind of health and fitness. If you are trying to train for something or prepare for an event, or even just kind of lose weight or things like that, then lack of sleep is working against you every step of the way. It's also a big kind of contributor to all sorts of psychiatric conditions, and it's been linked with, or lack of sleep has been linked with an increased risk of Alzheimer's, and it has had associations with just about every major psychiatric condition, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation or suicidality. But it's just we're not at full strength. We're not firing on all cylinders when we're not getting enough sleep. And whilst I would argue that 8 hours is maybe not applicable to everybody, because there's never a resounding or definite number that's a strict all or nothing. This is the answer. It will vary for people, just in the way that people's times of when they want to be asleep will vary. So we've got our natural larks that prefer to be up in the morning, and our night owls that don't like to go to sleep before midnight, and the mixture of those in between. But generally it's accepted that kind of 7 to 9 hours sleep is probably the ballpark of where you should be for getting all the benefits that sleep can give us, and staving off all those detrimental things from lack of sleep. But culturally, it's a difficult one, because there are cultures around the world that thrive, or reckon they thrive, or 5 hours sleep, and there are those in the developed world that just champion and prize and almost kind of hold up high the values of only sleeping for 4 or 5 hours of sleep. So 5 hours of sleep a night. So that comes under people like politicians such as Reagan and Thatcher. They always kind of championed how little they slept. If you hear anything motivational from Arnold Schwarzenegger, you'll find that he also looks at quite a small sleep window for what he's doing, which is unusual considering the background he's at, because the amount of training he would have had to do to kind of get where he is, then sleep and recovery is a huge thing. But napping's another issue, so maybe he was countering it there. But we get kind of this, surely 4 to 5 hours sleep is plenty, and you don't need any more than that. I'm not in that camp. I very much need my 8 hours sleep, or I am not in a good way the following morning. But the other thing is that we do work off a circadian rhythm. The body is kind of designed to be asleep for a certain period of time. We've kind of linked in with daylight hours in terms of the biochemical cues we have in our body for feeling alert, and then gradually kind of feeling more sleepy. They've done studies where they've kind of taken light out of the equation, and they reckon that the natural circadian rhythm actually sits between kind of 26 to 28 hours, but will adapt in. And with looking at that kind of 8 hour sleep, there's a definite kind of pattern to the sleep stages within it. So the early part of our night will be the deep non-rapid eye movement sleep, intermittent with kind of patches of your REM, your movement sleep, which is your dream sleep pretty much. But then the ratio changes throughout the night. So if you are cutting your sleep short, you're normally cutting down on the REM part, which can be quite useful in itself. But yeah, all sleep is not created equal, as it were. And there's been some research into looking at what these parts of the sleep do for the body. So your deep sleep is really good at clearing the brain of metabolic products through the glymphatic system, which not surprisingly sounds like the lymphatic system and does a very similar thing for the brain, and helps kind of decrease the amount of amyloid buildup, which has got a high link with Alzheimer's and things like that. So there is a function in terms of just kind of cleansing, recovery, not just for the body, for the brain itself, which is maybe why when we're lacking sleep that it's linked to so many of these psychological issues. But there's also kind of links to improving memory. We always kind of say, sleep on a problem and it's maybe solved in the morning. We know the benefits sometimes of if you've been studying and you're just staring at the page and it's not going in anymore, of sleeping on it and then kind of having a bit of a breakthrough. Same with people who are doing kind of creative things and those. But we've got this kind of 24/7 society. So we're seeing lots of people working shift work, lots of people trying to shift their circadian rhythm to a day versus night or somewhere in between. We used to see a lot of patients in the kind of on oncology clinics in Max Fax that would be working the 4 on, 4 off kind of rota. So they would do 4 days of nights, 4 days of days, and 4 days off in no particular order, but this kind of constant throw around of when day is night and what the body's going on about it. And as dentists, we're very aware of what that does to salivary flow and things like that. And in terms of kind of, we look at it in terms of kind of caries risk, I guess, and dry mouth risk and acidity and things like that. But there's a huge knock-on effect to the rest of the body. We're not necessarily kind of designed to do that. And whilst there are amongst us the larks who prefer to be up early, and the night owls that prefer to be up late, that may suit some more of these kind of out of sync shift working patterns. Again, they don't tend to kind of fit into it exactly. So you tend to find there are more health consequences for people working outside of their natural kind of sleep patterns. And even within a standard kind of 9 to 5 society, we see that the night owls particularly are at a disadvantage because they would benefit more from that early morning sleep. Because again, when we're talking about kind of where you reduce sleep, is they're going to bed later, they're just waking up sooner, so they end up with less sleep, because it's actually very difficult, if that's how you're wired, to bring forward that kind of bedtime to something you can actually fall asleep at easily. And age has something to do with it as well. So I mean, there's been studies recently and lots of kind of championing the idea that what we all know, teenagers have lots of sleep, but that they shift more towards that kind of night owl pattern during adolescence, and therefore maybe schools are starting too early. And if we're starting, if kids are getting on buses and getting at 7 o'clock in the morning, then it's not necessarily the best for their learning, memory and brain development. That actually starting at 10 would be a better idea. But obviously that then ties into working patterns of parents and this kind of 9 to 5 that we've kind of gone with and stuck with, and isn't going anywhere. That said, I guess in the event of advent of COVID and all its lockdowns and things like that, we are seeing lots more working from home and flexibility in that side of things, which might kind of gradually shift some of those days, and might be a way of finding a natural home for those that don't like their early mornings and prefer the late nights, and can actually then start to shift the work around it. But how do we know we're even lacking sleep? It's one of those things that it's like alcohol. The more drinks you know, the less you can kind of appreciate how drunk you are and think that you're okay to maybe get in that car and drive. It's kind of the same with sleep. As we get sleep deprived, we tend to be less aware of the effect that it's having on us. But generally speaking, it's kind of a drop in concentration, and the most devastating side of this that we see is road deaths, because so much of road accidents are a dip in concentration, and that can either be falling asleep at the wheel completely, or it can be micro sleeps, which is essentially because the body's system and sleep pressure is kind of built up to a point that you need sleep, is that your brain's turning off for just a few seconds at a time, which for most of us, most of the day won't have a huge impact. But when you're driving a car at 80 miles an hour, then that 2 seconds is quite a difference, and responsible for a lot of accidents and a lot of deaths. But yeah, so we've got kind of loss of concentration. Obvious ones are falling asleep, yawning all day long. But there were some studies in Australia recently that looked at the degree of concentration loss, and they were comparing people who they had got legally drunk, so to kind of like the drink drive levels, which I'm not sure what they are in Australia, but they were comparing those to people who had not had any alcohol but had been awake for 19 hours. And they found that they'd had the same concentration loss, that being awake for a 19-hour stretch, which would be the equivalent of having 5 hours of sleep a night, is that you would, by the end of that, you were the equivalent concentration-wise of having had a couple of drinks, which is quite a scary thing in itself. But they also saw that in other studies they've looked at emotional irrationality. That is kind of pretty much our likelihood to fly off the handle, of mood swings, of just being kind of triggered by stuff I always think of at work, but it can be the same at home. And the reason for that is they looked at it and they found that it was kind of a 60% amplification in the amygdala reactivity. So the amygdala is the bit that sits at the top of the brainstem and is kind of our emotionally regulator, I guess. It's our primary alert system in terms of what's going on in the environment, and it tends to be our first reaction to anything before we've had a chance to think about it. It tends to be an emotional one. And it's been likened to being the pedal in the car, in that the emotions kind of drive things, but that our brake and our control of that is our kind of thinky part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So the bit that we have kind of super developed, but it in terms of compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, but it has to be kind of plugged in or ready to go, as it were. And sleep deprivation, for want of a better description, kind of breaks down the communication between the two and leaves the driving to the amygdala, and that reactionary extremes of emotion, which again might kind of link into why sleep deprivation is so linked to your likes of your depression or aggressive behavior and thoughts of suicide, is that you're getting the extreme emotions without necessarily the rationality backing it up, or the thinky brain kind of weighing in on it. So yeah, there's loads of, we all know what we're like when we haven't had any sleep. I always find it's easier, certainly as a parent, and probably as if anyone's teacher out there, is it's easier to see in children. You only have to see kind of a late night in my kids, and they're Ari in the morning and they're fighting with each other and they'll be in tears over something really ridiculous. They're just more fragile. You can kind of see it all, and we know the importance of trying not to give them too many late nights in a row, because otherwise they're just foul to manage and deal with, particularly if that falls on the weekends or the school holidays. Otherwise they're foul and horrible to deal with for school. But again, it's that kind of, we can see the importance there, and I think this is kind of how we have to think about our own sleep patterns, is thinking about sleep routines. And when you think about sleep routines, it's kind of how to get a baby down, which if you're not a parent, you might not be familiar with, but it's exactly the same principles we'll get through to the end in terms of just getting into a routine. We are creatures that respond to a routine very well. Our entire circadian rhythm is a routine that's historically and evolutionary been kind of developed off light exposure and temperatures and things like that. But we get the same kind of routine from our days, even with artificial kind of light sources. But from, when we're timing our meals, when we're doing what we do, our work day, you'll notice the difference between kind of work days and weekends. And if you're on holiday, that your routine can get spun out and it's difficult to get back into. But we we do tend to rely on those for a lot of the cues for things like as we start to get sleepy and when we need to go to sleep. But kind of so what if we're not sleeping? Is it really that bad? Well, they actually took out of the Guinness Book of Records the record for the longest time someone went without sleep, because it's dangerous and people have died of sleep deprivation. And they've done studies into, and I don't know how they've done these studies because it seems incredibly unethical to see what you would kind of die of first, but they've equated it to being that you can only really go as long without sleep as you could without food. So it's quite a short period of time. I think it's something like 11 days, and people have died of sleep deprivation. They've broken that down and looked at it further and kind of done experiments where they've deprived people of certain types of sleep. So they've not let them get into a deep sleep. And I think it was that way around and not the REM sleep. But they deprived people of one side of sleep and found that they could kind of prolong life without sleep for maybe 45 days. But still, it wasn't particularly healthy, and it's not encouraged to do. But yeah, it's just we're not at our best when we're deprived of sleep. In a world where we're seeing more and more signs of burnout, and one of the big, I guess it's chicken or egg. Is it a risk factor for burnout, or is it that when you're burnt out, you exhibit this? But exhaustion is a big one. Tends to be the more kind of obvious one in women for some reason. Apparently, we all kind of will burn out slightly differently, and exhaustion tends to be the main one for women of the three signs of burnout. And you have to say, well, are we exhausted because we're burning out, or are we burning out as a result of exhaustion or as a contribution of exhaustion? So in terms of kind of implications for work, yes, there's a risk of if we are exhausted and we're not sleeping well and we're functioning on chronic sleep deprivation, that it's increasing our risk of burnout, it's increasing our risk of depression, and it's increasing our risk of general health worries and concerns. That, as I say, I keep going back to this, not your best self, but there's an exercise we do positive psychology wise where you look at kind of best self versus worst self. I've done it where you pick out two picture cards, so one that looks wonderful and one that looks horrendous, and then talk through how you see your best self or your worst self. And the best self side of it, you're alert, you're on your game, and you're ready to go, and you're most of the worst side kind of stuff when you're snappy and you're not quite being who you want to be in terms of, that sounds like a silly thing to say, but you feel like you're kind of snapping more than you'd want to be. You're not being the parent you want to be, not being the dentist you want to be. You're just not quite on top of it because you're taking things out of proportion, not coping with them well. Again, it tends to come under this tiredness. It can be a fuel or certainly a factor in all of these things. And if we're not our best self, then we're not communicating as well as we would like to be. We're not leading as well as we'd like to be. We're not making the best decisions. We're not planning the best of treatment, and we're not necessarily executing the best of treatment. So all of these things just make everything harder, make us more open to complaints, make us more open to running late and taking longer over our appointments, to increasing kind of conflicts with staff because we're not at our most considerate or empathetic selves. That we're probably planning treatment that's more risk averse, or kind of, as I'd call, kind of almost like get it done-itis or get home-itis, in terms of just too tired to be bothered to think about this, or just do the easiest thing and get patient out of the building as soon as possible. And it stops us thinking forward too much because we're too busy trying to cope with the now and getting through the next half an hour, next half a day, rather than thinking kind of beyond that. Because we have a very brain heavy occupations I've talked about before, in terms of we have to think a lot, diagnose a lot, react to things that we're not expecting, and adapt during our day. And if our prefrontal cortex, which is that thinky part of our brain, isn't firing on all cylinders, or isn't plugged in correctly to our amygdala, then we're not going to get our A game. We're going to contribute to that kind of decision fatigue and brain fatigue. It's going to impact our ability to learn, progress, master things, memorizing stuff, make logical decisions and choices. In a way, it's a bit like working drunk, which we would never do, but we don't think of sleep deprivation necessarily with the same kind of amount of seriousness. But it certainly it deserves its due. And it's some parts of it are such an easy fix. And we sometimes go full steam ahead to try and fix some much more difficult things that actually, if we addressed sleep first, it would make the rest of the things we're trying to change in life a lot easier as well. But there's also kind of the look of when is sleep not sleep. So alcohol, we've all, I'm sure, had huge nights out, and you wake up the following morning tired because whilst you've been passed out for the whole night, it hasn't felt like sleep. And that's true. Apparently it's kind of we're just sedated. We're not actually sleeping as such, which means that we don't see those cycles and patterns between that deep sleep and the dreaming sleep, that we're not seeing and getting those physiological kind of effects of that drainage and cleaning of the of metabolic products from the brain, of forming, kind of committing things to memory, because we're not getting that kind of just all the stuff that brains do. We're just not getting it. And likewise, kind of sleeping tablets, not necessarily sleep. Anyone that's had a general anaesthetic in adulthood will know that takes a week to recover from. Probably yes, because you've got lots of drugs kind of gone through the system, but also all that time you were supposedly asleep is you were anaesthetised. It was not the same, and your body is still trying to catch up then with your deep sleep and your REM sleep, and it takes a while to kind of get things back into sync and back into order. Same as our sedated patients in the chair, they're not sleeping, and it may interrupt their sleep patterns because of that. So what can we do? What is this kind of easy fix for sleep? Some of it is just being aware of it, because I don't think some of us pay it much attention and don't think much of having a 4 or 5 hour night's sleep. And we know the extremes. We know if we've lost an entire night's sleep, we know that we're kind of baggage in the morning, but not realizing necessarily that chronic less than. And sometimes it's not intentional, because there's, anxiety plays a role in this, as I was talking about the pandemic before, in terms of kind of either not sleeping as well because you've got too much on your mind when you're coming out of sleep and waking, and then not being able to get back to sleep at like 2-3 in the morning, or waking up early and not being able to get back to sleep full stop. So waking up kind of 3-4, and that's your night's sleep done because you've got everything on the go. So it's not always that we're intentionally going to bed late or getting up super early because we've planned all sorts of things, or because we've read some book that says that our miracle morning is going to start at 5, but we're not that kind of person and it just exhausts us, or that we're up studying and we're studying into the wee hours, so thinking that we're doing things that are productive and helpful, and almost kind of writing off the benefits of that against the benefits of a good night's sleep. So what do we need to do? Well, as I said, it's like that bedtime routine, thinking of your babies, of your toddlers. It's exactly the same in terms of slowing down for the evening, that preparing to go to sleep and getting sleepier starts kind of 2 hours before you go to bed. Trying to keep that bedtime at the same time, trying to keep it the same distance from your last meal. So again, it all kind of comes into routine. So we're not eating just before we go to bed. We're not necessarily drinking loads before we go to bed, because the same as, you tell your toilet training toddlers, is that you don't want to be giving them a massive glass of water because they're going to be up in the night to go to the toilet, or, well, in the case of a toddler, probably more to wet the bed. But it's the same thing. If we drink loads before we go to bed, we're going to have disrupted sleep because we're going to have to get up and go to the toilet earlier, or for sure in the night. And trimming down that kind of social media exposure. So yes, I'm going to come on to screens and things in a minute, but I'm thinking more in terms of not trying to provoke an extreme emotional response in that last, kind of hour before you go to bed. So you don't need to be kind of going on social media and hearing polarizing opinions about vaccinations or politics or religion or something that's inadvertently you might come across that's going to really wind you up, that you've then got to wind back down from. No news, same thing. Don't read kind of stuff that there's going to be no difference whether you find out 5 minutes before you go to bed or you find out 5 minutes after you've woken up. It's just going to get your mind spinning, and you don't need to do it. Reduce exposure to bright lights. So that can be anything from easier in the winter, kind of dimming down lights, not having everything full on, keeping away from your screens and your phones and things, because that kind of extreme blue light that particularly comes from phones and devices is the opposite kind of signal that we're after. That goes back to that evolutionary bright blue light. It's time to wake up. This is daylight. The day's starting. And we don't need to be doing that just before we go to bed, because it's actually going to delay or put off those signals that we should be getting sleepy and going to sleep. Looking at kind of wind down activities, so a bath or a shower. I was talking about I'd like to read a bit of non-fiction just to put my mind on something else that I'm not likely to kind of then ruminate over overnight. Might be a meditation practice, might be a gratitude practice, might be journaling before you go to sleep, but in a way that's going to promote positive emotion rather than get you kind of wound up or thinking just before you go to sleep. Is your room dark enough to go to sleep in? So not as much an issue in the winter. If you're in a certain part of either hemisphere that gets dark enough early enough that your room's going to be dark. But in the summer it can be an issue, particularly if it stays light till quite late. Are we looking at kind of block out curtains, something like that, the same way you would for a baby's room if they're not sleeping? Is you want to kind of keep that signal to the body, because we can sense when our eyes are closed whether the room is dark or not. We will sleep better in the dark. Making sure the room is cold enough. We need it to be that little bit cooler to fall asleep, which is why it's harder to fall asleep in the summer and in the heat. So again, just kind of addressing the temperature in our rooms. And another one is I always kind of keep devices charging elsewhere. Combination of all the flashy little LED lights, but also tends to just be more of an undisturbed night's sleep. And if you can get one of those alarm clocks where you can hit a button and the lights go off on it, so that's not glaring at you all night, so that when you wake up at 1 a.m, you're like, 5 hours till I have to get up. It just kind of takes that out, and it's easier to fall back asleep. Sleep monitoring can be quite useful. So I've got a Garmin Forerunner something or other, and it's useful in terms of it will give me a readout when I've been asleep and when I've not. It's not useful in terms of I've developed a reaction to the silicone strap, and I can't wear it for too prolonged a period. Also not that useful in terms of when I went on the website and looked how accurate it is at predicting when you're asleep, when you're not, and what sleep stages you're in. It's actually only 70% accurate, which is pretty bad, but it's better than nothing, and it's a starting point, and it will at least give you something to compare like with like. So they're all just easy sleep hygiene stuff. It's not rocket science. I always say don't rush at it and suddenly change everything, but if there's just been something in there that I've talked about today that you suddenly think, I could do that differently, and it might just be, I don't think we've even really talked so much about caffeine, but it might be not having a coffee or anything caffeinated after midday, because the half-life of caffeine is like 5.5 hours. So anything in the latter half of the day is going to affect your ability to fall asleep. Maybe trying to cut out alcohol to help you get to sleep or de-stress from your day. It might be just setting a bedtime. You may be horrendous at going to bed at the right time and it's all over the place, and that might be kind of part of your issue. It may be just that dark room thing. So there's loads there, and you can go at it and go through the full list, or you can just pick something that makes it a little bit better, because at the end of the day, if we can just pick the low-hanging fruit, something that's easy to do, that doesn't feel like you're going to fall flat in your face giving it a go, and just seeing whether it will make just that small bit of impact, because just those small bits and those small steps will all add up. So it doesn't have to be that you get your sleep totally nailed down, but if you're doing a little bit of stuff towards your sleep, a little bit of stuff towards your nutrition, and making sure that you're kind of moving at a time of day that works for you, not necessarily kind of high intensity exercise right before you go to bed, you'll know what exercise works for you and what wakes you up and what gets you sleepy. So never, it can seem overwhelming that there's lots mentioned, but always just pick one thing, give it a go, see what it does. If it doesn't work for you, you've given it a go, you know it's there for next time if you need it, but pick the next thing on the list and give it a go, and before you know it, we'll have that resilience toolbox all stacked up for you, and you'll be able to take whatever life throws. So thanks for listening. Shout out to a book recommend, I guess, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. So that's been kind of my main information source beyond kind of my teachings and my normal coaching practices. And it's definitely worth a read. It's a bit information heavy in terms of it does go into a lot of those studies in a lot more detail. And it is written as more of a kind of an academic read, I guess. But thank you for joining the conversation. We will get to something else in our resilience toolbox for next week. I've got a couple of things up my sleeves, depending on how the week goes, depending on kind of what comes to the forefront for next time. And as always, join the conversation on Twitter. I'm at fang_Farrier and can be found on Facebook at It's a Dentist Life and as Ems Courtney. Cheers. See you next time.